Great. So I am the host and the co-host today. I want to first talk about our partners. This is a program of the Wisconsin Center for Evaluation Research clinical program, the Wisconsin Evaluation Collaborative, and in partnership with the Department of Public Instruction with support from the Institute for Educational Sciences at the Department of Ed. The format is that it's a 5-minute flash talk presentation that I'm going to be giving with a hard stop after 5 minutes, followed by a discussion prompt, and then 15 to 20 minutes of discussion in small groups, then followed by about 5 minutes of question and answer and kind of large group discussion. So today is kind of an introductory orientation setting session for the Flash Talk series itself. I'm going to briefly talk about two concepts, knowledge mobilization and praxis, that drive the purpose and context and structure of this series. Okay, with that, I'm going to turn on my timer so I keep myself accountable. All right. So the first of these two frameworks or concepts that I want to talk about is knowledge mobilization, oftentimes used with an acronym of KMB. This is a term we both know what these two, or we all know what these two words mean alone, but together as a knowledge mobilization concept came out of Canada, but is being used more and more in the United States. There are kind of two assumptions within this type of framework. We can kind of, on a common sense plane, kind of understand what do we mean when we say knowledge mobilization, but to unpack a little bit about what these two terms mean within and what sorts of assumptions we have within a knowledge mobilization framework. So first, to think about the concept of knowledge. So within a knowledge mobilization framework, we're assuming that knowledge itself is constructed. There's no one absolute truth within knowledge. It's constructed. It's also contested. It's complex. It's impacted by power dynamics. It's impacted by one's own social and personal identities. It's impacted by our collective identities and our communities. It's fluid. Then secondly, to think about what mobilization means. What does it mean to mobilize? Within this framework, mobilization is very much about it being multi-directional. So it's not about better communicating research to practitioners. That's part of it, obviously. It is more about building knowledge together across all different kinds of expertise and experiences in a particular area, in our case, education. And therefore, a knowledge mobilization framework is very much about it being participatory, equitable, and also transformative. So then that brings us into that next concept of praxis. So praxis is oftentimes in the context of research and evaluation talked about an in-between space between research and practice, or theory and practice. So I want to first talk about praxis as a noun. The work of Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot, a sociologist at Harvard, is really informative to me in terms of understanding these in-between spaces. She says we must develop a way of seeing the two-ness of life, the fundamental dualisms in between spaces that are threaded through life's experiences. So praxis as a noun to me is an in-between spaces, again, often in terms of research and practice or theory and practice, but can also be much beyond that. For example, between art and science, or between imagination and evidence. So secondly, to think of praxis as a verb. So praxis as reflection and action towards change, and that's where that transformative piece comes, towards changing the systems and structures that we need to disrupt and that we need to change. And this is, so from Paulo Freire, liberation is a praxis, the action and reflection of men and women upon their world in order to transform it. So this idea of transformation is really key to how we think about praxis and how we are thinking about it in the terms of this series. In my own work, I often focus on education policy. So when it comes to praxis and knowledge mobilization, I often find myself asking questions like these of the many stakeholders involved in education policy. So what knowledge and for what purpose? And you think about, and these are in no way the only stakeholders involved in education policy, but some of the most important. And understanding that these identities are complex and they're not mutually exclusive. So many of us fall into a number of these different types of identities ourselves. So thinking about what does knowledge mean? What is knowledge across these different identities, and for what purpose is central to what and how we're thinking about organizing this knowledge mobilization series in this process. Okay, so the prompt that I'm going to present to this group for some discussion that we'll break out and have is to think about, well, first of all, you'll introduce yourselves in whatever way you feel is most salient. And then the prompt is, what and whose knowledge holds the most power in education? So power is a really important concept to think about when we think about who constructs knowledge, who communicates knowledge, how is knowledge used, whose knowledge is used, who is seen as experts, especially in a space like education. So I would love the small group conversation to think about, again, both what and whose knowledge holds the most power in education. And I specifically didn't say in K-12 education or in higher education or in education policy or in schooling, but think about those differences between schooling and education, for example, between formal and informal education, before school-based and community-based education or family-based education. So with that, I'm going to stop recording